Hello, folks, and welcome to our next lecture, Women in Prosperity, Depression, and War, the 1920s through the 1940s. And we'll go ahead and break this down into two different parts. The first part covering the Great Depression and New Deal years of the 1920s and 30s, and the World War II experience of the 1940s. So, one of the great developments, of course, in the early 20th century was the constitutional amendment to allow women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in 1920. And this culminated, of course, in a many decades long effort, struggle, protest by women voting rights activists to properly enfranchise women across the country and by constitutional decree, and to make American democracy now inclusive of women as voters and as office holders. Now, in the lead up, of course, to the suffrage amendment, there had been a great deal of opposition, conservative opposition, much of which was predicated upon the idea that giving women the right to vote would somehow destroy the traditional roles of women in America, particularly within the American family, that making a woman, in effect, the equal, say, of her husband politically would somehow undermine the patriarchal authority of the family and with it unravel the basic cohesion of American society generally. Well, these were the rather pointed fears expressed in opposition to women's voting. But the question arises then, once women do have the right to vote, what happens next? What consequences will follow from this great development now in the political history of the country? And the short answer is that not much happens. That is, it turns out the enfranchisement of women, that is, giving women the right to vote, sometimes called the suffrage, resulted not in a great unraveling of traditional American families or social values, etc., but rather a kind of status quo effect. As Eleanor Roosevelt would comment, no revolution has come about because women have been given the vote. And it is perfectly true that many women are not thrilled by their opportunity to take part in political party work. And what Eleanor Roosevelt was talking here about, in part, was that women's own attitudes about the vote were less than unanimous in their support for political action or political activism by women. Many women, even women who supported the right to vote, did not at the same time there support a separate women's cause in politics. Many women proved to be relatively conservative as voters, either voting along with their husbands or voting the status quo of the party line. And fewer women proved to be, I guess what we would say, activist in their views of voting and political participation. And so the short answer to the question, what happened in the country politically as a result of the women's right to vote, was that in a lot of ways, politics maintained a kind of status quo, with women not dramatically changing the political course of things, either because they voted conservatively along with their husbands or towed the political party line. So it will take some time, as we'll see, for there to develop in America something like a separate political consciousness among women that could be measured in electoral terms as playing a part in determining elections and developing new social policies and that sort of thing. But for the immediate period of the 1920s, that doesn't seem to happen. Now, that is not to say that we don't see the organizing of women into political action groups. The League of Women Voters, for example, organized in 1920, was a fairly had a fairly conservative platform. It did encourage women's registration as voters, but then tended to stress what were seen as traditional women's issues within the family. In other words, the League of Women Voters wasn't pushing for greater female activism on behalf of, say, feminist issues, but more traditional issues within the family, and had as its overall goal the rather modest goal of teaching women how to be good citizens. So a fairly conservative bent, but nevertheless, one of the notable organizations that will emerge now in the wake of the suffrage amendment, the League of Women Voters. Keep in mind that for much of the 1920s, men and women alike in America devoted their attention to the material issues of the age. That is, Americans tended to be given over to materialism in the 20s rather than politics. As a political decade, the 20s was something of a conservative, rather placid era in American history. The president most associated with the 20s was himself seen as a rather buttoned-down, placid conservative by the name of Calvin Coolidge. And Coolidge was famously quoted as saying in that decade that the chief business of the American people, dramatic pause, the chief business of the American people is business. And so it wasn't the political aspirations that received or political activism that received the most attention in the 20s, but typically the exploits of others connected, say, to the business interests of the country. No one more notable in that regard than Henry Ford, the great automaker. Henry Ford made a kind of famous promise to America in the 1920s, having installed the assembly line system of automobile manufacturing in his Ford auto plant in Michigan. Ford promised that, quote, "I will build a car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for." And note here, Ford is promising a car for the family. And so from the beginning, America's industrial production will have among its various sort of marketing targets, will have women and women's interests at heart. That is, for Henry Ford to properly sell and market his automobiles, he will appeal to a special gendered interest among women as wives and mothers, as members of families, to see the automobile as somehow affirming of the family mission in America. Now, this is also coming at a time when a growing number of women are entering the workforce again in the United States, and so that also meant potentially that women were themselves now consumers in most of the markets that business have drummed up in the decade. If we look at some of the numbers here, 25% of the American workforce by 1930 is constituted by women. That is, women make up a quarter of the workforce by 1930, and a growing percentage of those working women were married. So not only do we have a kind of high water mark up to that point for women in the overall workforce of the country, but we also have a growing trend toward working women, or married women as working women. So what does this suggest? It suggests that this new industrial economy, with its great expansion of industry into the consumer goods market, that is, goods marketed to families, include now a kind of economic appeal for women to have consumer power, that is, purchasing power. And for women to have purchasing power, of course, they had to have jobs and earn income. So there's a kind of cyclical relationship here to the development of consumer industry and marketing and women entering the workforce in order to supplement, say, family incomes and become purchasers in their own right. Yeah, much of the economy of the 20s is notably geared toward consumers. That is, individuals who would have the purchasing power, presumably, to buy what was coming off the assembly line. And much of this was focusing now on the purchasing power, in particular, of middle class families, and as I say, women's purchasing taste. That is, the trend toward women as consumers and income earners within the family. And you see how marketing in the 1920s will also draw this explicit connection. You see here an advertisement for kitchen cabinetry, the tagline, bringing the kitchen up to date. And the idea was here that the kitchen, seen perhaps as the domain of women's domestic laborers, is now also part of a marketing strategy, in particular for middle class women who wish to see their kitchens not only in terms of their functionality, but in terms of their appeal and aesthetic design. So, form and function here, adding up to a new marketing possibility. Everything from plates and dishes to cabinetry, tiled floors, light fixtures, sink and plumbing fixtures, you name it. If it could be put into the middle class home, it could be made part of the marketing appeal to American middle class women. And that includes now technological gadgets of the age like the radio. The radio quickly will become a staple of many middle class homes, almost universally owned and enjoyed, in part because the programming of radio, which included things like news programming and even music and entertainment, will also have its appeal for women. That is, radio programming specifically made for women in terms of dramas and what will come to be called soap operas in productions that were assumed to be special interest to the middle class female listener. Of course, what we remember the 20s for was its flamboyance. As one commenter of the era put it, the 20s were an era of wonderful nonsense. The roaring 20s, as we like to think of them. And when, in high school we have dress-up days and decade days, the 20s typically, manifests the costumes of the jazz age, of the age of the flapper, of the age of the new woman, as she was known. The new woman who depicted as now more independent, particularly young, independent, self-reliant, partly because she was assumed to have a job and thus her own purchasing power, more inclined to break away from her mother's Victorian norms. The skirts got shorter, the shirts or blouses got sleeveless, the caps became more fanciful, the hair was bobbed, and all in all, a more flamboyant and even sexualized imagery now associated with American femininity in the age of the flapper. And of course, where cultural trends occurred, marketing couldn't be far behind. So even though in this perfume advertisement, you see this sort of buttoned down, more respectable kind of people, the traditional images of perhaps the wealthy, you also see now the unmistakable image of the new woman, the woman with her bobbed hair and her costume jewelry and her flashy skirts. So marketing was always quick to conform itself to whatever cultural trends were going on, and this became an important arbiter of those trends as well. So yeah, the Roaring Twenties, a time of cultural diversions and entertainment for the masses and symbols of personal expression. If you look carefully, you'll note that this happens to be a speeding car with a lion in the sidecar. I'm just going to let that settle for a second. When we say an age of wonderful nonsense, we make room for speeding cars traveling around a centrifuge, toting a lion in the sidecar. Well, getting back to our focus on women, we see that personal expression could include not only the wearing of stylish cloche hats or new skirts or costume jewelry, but also tattoo work. And we see here an early image from the 20s of a tattoo artist inking a design onto a woman's legs. So this was all pretty audacious, considering that the country was just coming out of the very conservative Victorian era, and I think that was part of the flamboyance of the 20s, the kind of generational divide between older women and younger women, between mothers and their daughters. Is this mostly a white middle class preoccupation? Yeah, in terms of the Roaring 20 imagery, it is often sort of restrictively white and middle or upper middle class, and it's certainly marketed that way. You could buy flapper fashions right from the Sears and Roebuck catalog if you chose to. Um, and so, that becomes a kind of iconic image of the decade, but it really only speaks to a certain segment of the women's population in this country. Cultural trends throughout the 20s, could be communicated to target audiences, whether through radio or magazines and movies, for example, extolling new consumer standards of beauty, or in the case of Hollywood movies, in the terms of restrictions. The Hays Code was actually a self-regulating by Hollywood of the content and the rating of the content of its movies. There were many cultural critics who thought that Hollywood movies had become too sexual, too forward in their presentation of female sexuality in particular. And so ultimately, with enough political pressure, Hollywood agreed to a rating system that would let moviegoers know just how much sex appeal they could expect in watching a particular movie, and overall sort of discouraging that sort of thing. Here you see a famous cover from Vogue, or a famous image from Vogue magazine. We're talking about mass marketing of media and advertising, such that a photograph that would appear in a popular fashion magazine like Vogue, showing women with the contemporary styles, looking very forward, very progressive, very modern, could have a great impact on subsequent consumer trends. So magazines, for sure, magazines and movies and radio programs could help define these trends that now stylized women's fashion, women's look, and even women's behavior. In the case of Hollywood, the famous It girl, Clara Bow, who becomes a kind of iconic figure, her makeup, her hair, and even the roles she played toward reinforcing some of the cultural trends of the new woman, as she was called, a more sexual, confidently sexual woman, a more glamorous woman than Americans had been used to during the Victorian age. It was also the jazz age, of course, and we should acknowledge here that not all the marketing, not all the targeting of images is to the white middle class. Jazz itself was a music steeped in black musical traditions. That is, the musicality of African and African American traditions right on through the centuries of slavery, now into the post-slavery, post-emancipation years of American culture. as whites began to discover the musical fashions of black people in this country and finding a popular appeal in those musical expressions, whether it was gospel music or ragtime or famously by the 1920s jazz and later on blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. You name it, much of American popular music in the modern age has derived from those African American traditions of musicality. One of the great composers and jazz artists of the age, Duke Ellington, said there is hardly any money interest in art, and music will be there when money is gone. So, attesting to the long-standing appeal of music, not only black music, but also black women now finding their way into the jazz age. Bessie Smith, a great sort of jazz bluesy singer of the 1920s, an African American woman, will become a popular recording artist now in the age of the phonograph, in the age of radio, in the age of the jazz club. An iconic musical figure, Bessie Smith, one of the first African American women to attain a kind of commercial and cultural notoriety now in the 20th century. And as the musical culture suggests, a kind of pushing of boundaries. Dance halls are popular in the 20s, a place where one could go and listen to jazz music or dance music, to dress in the costumes of the new woman, the flapper, and even though it was the era of prohibition, to find ways to sneak in some alcohol, some moonshine whiskey or bathtub gin, what have you, and to have a good time, to party. But again, pushing boundaries, pushing in fact toward what was a kind of sexual revolution in the 1920s, which will draw many critics, out of the woodwork. Those who see the dance hall as a place of sinful behavior, as a place of promiscuity and the decline of female morality, will steep their criticism in sort of traditional arguments against women's sexuality and against women's sexual independence apart, from procreation and marriage. A famous line from a novel of the age had a female character exclaiming, quote, "I've kissed a dozen men, and I suppose I'll kiss dozens more." And so a kind of militant embrace of independent sexual authority will not only be part of this cultural mix, but will inspire its own sort of pushback by more conservative cultural critics. And that was the sort of thing that, you would see here in what was today seemingly an almost comical poster, an anti-saloon league poster. The Anti-Saloon League had been one of the supporters, of course, of prohibition, had been one of many temperance organizations that had called for the end of alcohol production and sales in the United States. And it was during the Prohibition era of the 1920s, when the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol was constitutionally prohibited, that you saw these sort of moralistic calls for men in this case to no longer drink. The tagline here, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours," with some grim-faced temperance advocates, anti-saloon league advocates, suggesting that if their men were to drink, then they would no longer reward them with sexual favors, or at least that's the sort of subtext of the image here. Well, a lot of this wonderful nonsense, as we might frame it, comes to a crashing halt, shall we say, by October of 1929. The famous stock market crash of that month and year will quickly be advertised and headlined across the country in the newspapers and media of the age to what we will eventually know as the Great Depression. So the sort of catalyst now for what will come to be called the Great Depression, the stock market crash of 1929, as the New York Times reported the day after, on October 25th, the most disastrous decline in the biggest and broadest stock market of history rocked the financial district yesterday. It carried down with it speculators big and little in every part of the country, wiping out thousands of accounts. And so what would become now the worst economic crisis in the history of the United States, the Great Depression of the 1930s, will itself, as we'll see, have a strongly gendered component. That is to say, what Americans would come to know as hard times and hard traveling. The Great Depression will have its own gendered component. And you can see that here in this photograph now of a billboard posted by in one town by the local Chamber of Commerce that specifically referenced men. Jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. So on the one hand, the face of poverty was gendered as a masculine face, that is, out of work men. But as we'll see, the Great Depression also dramatically affected the lives of women. And that was in part because the Depression has its roots also in the consumer economy of the 1920s. What in the 1920s have been hailed as the great advance, the consumer revolution of the 20s, the buying, for example, of Ford automobiles. The Ford Model T had been sold in 1926 for as little as $290, and yet 75% of Americans who purchased an automobile did so on the installment plan. That is, they took advantage of consumer credit to borrow the money for their purchase, and it was that consumer reliance on consumer credit, which flipped on its head, meant the accumulation of consumer debt now that would affect women, particularly in the middle class consumer families. And as you can see here, again, the automobile having been marketed as a family based technology wherein women and daughters and families could ride along on Sunday drives, that now the consumer crunch and the defaulting on consumer debt will then affect the lives of women in those families. So as the economy is crumbling in American cities, as the phenomenon of bread lines and soup kitchens become a familiar sight, we can also find in that gendered expression of the Depression a rising hostility toward women. It was claimed by some that the Depression had actually been caused by the entry of women into the workplace, that is, taking away jobs that otherwise would have been slated for men. And so there were cultural critics who tried to put the blame squarely on the shoulders of women, who, the implication being, were somehow too greedy, too sort of thoughtless and ungrateful, to be that independent, to dare make an income for themselves and thus undermine the stability of the breadwinners, the male breadwinner's role in the family. All right, so this was all part of the sort of backlash now against the new woman of the 20s as the Depression deepens. An ecological disaster would coincide, of course, with the economic disaster, forcing migration and relocation across the Southwest and making a mockery of domesticity and true womanhood. And I'm talking now about the Dust Bowl, which was not directly related, of course, to the stock market crash. It had more to do with the cycle of ecology in the American Southwest and the low annual total of rainfall. But the infamous Dust Bowl, coinciding as it does with the Depression, will have a devastating effect on the lives of women, as countless women across the American Southwest, as farm wives and daughters and mothers now seek to, in effect, keep the bonds of family together as everything seemingly crumbles around them. Uh, People defaulting on loans and losing their farms, being forced to uproot and locate, to migrate, the Great Okie Migration to California, for example, now putting a special burden on women to maintain domesticity, and making a mockery really out of that old conservative concept of true womanhood, because true womanhood always presumed that women had the sort of financial wherewithal to locate themselves within that narrow conservative band of what was deemed acceptable women's appearance, acceptable genteel women's appearance and behavior. But now you're living in shanties, you're living in your car, you're living in tents. It was all one could do just to keep, a family barely together, let alone try to measure up to some, almost academic sense of true womanhood. The Okie migration to California along Route 66, the country's major east-west thoroughfare, um, known sometimes as the Mother Road, aided the westward flight of migrants and provided a direct route from the Dust Bowl states of Oklahoma and Texas, and Arkansas, etc., into the working agricultural working fields of California. This was a process, of course, that was captured in the great American novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which drew these stark portraits of women's lives in the persons of the mothers and sisters and daughters of the families, the so-called Okie families that made that migration. As one of the characters said in The Grapes of Wrath, maybe we can start again in the new rich land in California where the fruit grows. We'll start over. So that sort of hoped for rebirth along the highway as cars packed full with the family's earthly belongings, including mothers and their infant babies, had to somehow make the best and cling to that hope that somehow better days were ahead. But not surprisingly, better days were slow to come, and hard times fell right on the shoulders of women just as they did men. Maybe the most famous single photograph of a woman during the 1930s Dust Bowl years was this Dorothea Lange photograph, which she entitled The Migrant Mother. And according to the photographer Dorothea Lange, I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. So, one of the most accomplished women artists of her age, Dorothea Lange, a photographer who was commissioned by the federal government during the Great Depression to take pictures of ordinary people's lives, including migrant farm workers throughout the Southwest and California. This woman's name was Florence Owens Thompson, and she recalled this picture differently than Dorothea Lange herself. It formed me, she said, of the famous photo, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. I've never gotten over it, and I'm aware of the force and power of it. Florence Thompson said she was embarrassed by her circumstances. The picture itself had been, I guess we could say, slightly choreographed, as the photographer had told the children, in fact, to look away from the mother to enhance the dramatic quality, the sense of impoverishment or even shame. And this was something Florence Thompson rather resented. It was her impression that the picture would be more flattering than the one that eventually became so famous. Nativist anger in the 1920s was often directed at those who would work from outside the cultural radius of white America. What I'm talking about here was the U.S. government's repatriation policy instituted in the 1930s that forced deportation from California and other states of hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers, including Mexican Americans who were often caught up in the deportation. That is, those who had been born in the United States, nevertheless swept up in the mass deportations of the federal government. Some estimates they made up as many as half the total of those who were deported, mostly from the farm fields of California. And this was in response to the charge now that Mexicans were taking the jobs that white farmers themselves could have. Well, okay, we have a complicated relationship here between not only native born and immigrants, but also the different ethnic lines crossing over from white to brown. This photograph you see here is the family of Cesar Chavez, who would later become, of course, a great advocate for farm workers. Here you see Chavez as a young boy posing with his brothers and sisters. Now, they were American born. He was born in El Paso, Texas, and yet lost their land as many in the Southwest did, forced to pile into the family automobile and migrate to California, where Cesar Chavez recalled that his family not only suffered the burdens of all impoverished farm workers, but double the burden, really, because they were non-white, because they were Latino, because their skin was brown, or because they spoke Spanish. This is the truth, Chavez recalled. It's history. Now, in the midst of this crisis, a political New Deal promised to the country in depression by the candidate for president in 1932 of the Democratic Party. That was Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course, and it was Roosevelt's victory in 1932 that led to the political program known as the New Deal. And it was in his inaugural address in March of 1933 that FDR first spoke those famous words that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so FDR from the beginning was attempting to rally the American spirit to overcome what was the tangible emotional component of the Great Depression. And as he said, to convert retreat into advance, to rally the country, to rally American business in support of a New Deal. But the question is, was it a New Deal for women? Well, the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, usually referred to as the first 100 days, saw a flurry of legislative activity, the likes of which the country had never or rarely seen. 15 different major bills passed by Congress during those 100 days, creating the so-called alphabet soup agencies. That is, new federal agencies like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. These are the public works programs mostly, or business regulation agencies, set up in the first 100 days of the New Deal to provide recovery, relief, and reform to a depressed America. And so naturally, women are going to be drawn in to the affairs of the New Deal because so much of what providing relief, for example, was about was helping families, sustaining homeless families or impoverished families. The NRA, one of those New Deal agencies, stood for the National Recovery Administration, not to be confused with the modern NRA, the gun nuts. The National Recovery Administration, which was created by Roosevelt to organize American businesses on the path to recovery. The NRA set up to establish so-called codes of fair competition in an effort to stimulate business recovery. "Yes, you remembered me," said one of the NRA ads showing Franklin Roosevelt shaking the hands of an American farmer. But really, what the NRA was about was trying to regulate the cycles of American business, which of course had an impact on the lives of ordinary Americans who were either laid off or saw their wages cut during the Depression. And from the beginning, the NRA utilized the tactics of propaganda, mass marketing, and as we're going to see here, gendered imagery. In this case, in a restaurant, a woman employee pinning an NRA flag to the restaurant window featuring the patriotic Blue Eagle and the tagline, "We do our part." This was seen as a patriotic effort, a patriotic gesture that women now had as much to do with as men. And when all else failed, you could use sex appeal to promote the NRA, such as these women here who seem to have the emblem emblazoned on the bare skin of their backs. So a kind of appeal, a sex appeal to the political interests of the New Deal. Maybe more seriously was the effort by the Works Progress Administration to appeal directly now to women and employment. That is an attempt to cross over that controversial divide to once again suggest that women had an important part to play in America's economy. That is the maintaining of skills and the bolstering of self-respect among women, providing the unemployed with useful work in all areas of public life, natural resource conservation, artistic and cultural programs. Dorothea Lange, for example, who I mentioned a minute ago, was a photographer who was put to work by the WPA to take photographs as part of a cultural program in America. Yet those nagging questions about labor and gendered conflicts over labor and human rights emerge, just as the repatriation project of the 30s deported many Mexican and Mexican American men and women from the country in a burst of sort of nativist hostility. Now, during the World War II years in the 1940s, we'll see the so-called Bracero program, which will actively recruit and bring back to the United States many of the Mexican laborers, men and women, to work in the farm fields, for example, of the California Central Valley, while American workers were seen as occupied by defense industry work or by military service. So what the left hand could take away, the right hand could bring back. And this caused a great deal of concern among labor advocates for the potential now of the abuse and misuse of immigrant labor, always with that threat of deportation hanging over its head, with the rights of workers, the basic wage and work conditions of workers be respected in a country that showed itself perfectly willing to be rid of them when it desired. Here you see a solitary woman carrying a protest sign that says "Stop Illegal Raids" by the Immigration Department. So, as we saw during the World War I years, the complicated relationship in America between native-born and immigrant, between the federal government and immigrant people, that has continued into our own time when it seems politically viable or valuable to do so, using the fear of immigrants, the threat of lost jobs, or in our own time of terrorist activity, sort of mashing them all up into one emotional anti-immigrant appeal. Political appeal will have, of course, direct effect on the lives not just of immigrants, but women immigrants who, again, are charged with trying to maintain homes and to keep families together. And we've seen that with the current travel ban, for example, as family members, whether they be wives, sisters, brothers, sons, are kept from entering the country in response to the executive order and the ban on immigrants, splitting families, estranging husbands from wives and mothers from children. So these political hot button issues always have an effect on women's lives. What we see in the New Deal, maybe most dramatically, is a new kind of political partnership. You know, I quoted Eleanor Roosevelt earlier, but I want to come back to her now. The wife of the president, Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt will become a political force in her own right now in the 1930s. Remember, her husband FDR is going to be elected 4 times to the presidency beginning in 1932, and so she will be first lady for nearly a decade and a half, and will during that time do what virtually no presidential wife had ever done in American history, and that is carve out a highly recognizable political role for herself through her own political activism and work on behalf of the poor and the needy. Eleanor Roosevelt will be a political force in the 1930s. As the faraway Auckland Star, New Zealand newspaper had it, there is no better known woman in all the world than Eleanor Roosevelt. And, you know, there's so much to say about the Roosevelts. You know, their marriage, which had been consummated back in 1905, over time had become less a romantic or intimate marriage, but because of Franklin Roosevelt's marital affair, would become more like a political partnership. In other words, Eleanor and Franklin will never divorce, not even as Franklin Roosevelt maintains a relationship with another woman throughout the 1920s and 1930s, a woman who at one time had served as Eleanor Roosevelt's personal secretary. Instead of divorce, Eleanor Roosevelt will choose a kind of different path. In return for supporting her husband's political aspirations, Eleanor Roosevelt will take from him assurances that she could pursue her own political causes. And so the Depression now will give Eleanor Roosevelt really a kind of almost unimaginable opportunity to assert her own influence on behalf of the causes that she held dear. As one of her close friends, Lorena Hickok, said of West Virginia coal miners, and in those houses every night children went to sleep hungry on piles of bug-infested rags spread out on the floor. And it will be the cause of depressed, impoverished West Virginia coal miners, for example, that Eleanor Roosevelt will go to work. She will lobby to have new homes built for impoverished coal miners and will push one of the New Deal agencies, the National Industrial Recovery Administration, to set aside, with her husband's support, $25 million in loans for so-called subsistence homesteads that would provide relief for quote-unquote stranded populations. Over 50 subsistence homestead communities are established in the United States during the Great Depression, in part because of Eleanor Roosevelt's lobbying of Congress and of her husband's cabinet. One of the better known examples in West Virginia was in the coal mining town of Scotts Run, where a new community known as Arthurdale of subsistence homesteads will be built. And Eleanor Roosevelt won't just take an academic interest in this. She will travel to Scotts Run, West Virginia. She will get to know the coal miners, their families, the wives, the fathers, the children, almost a first name basis, really. And when the project was culminated to build Arthurdale, the subsistence homestead project, which should for the first time give some of the poorest workers in America, indoor plumbing, for example, and electricity, insulated homes, that sort of thing, she will be invited back to help celebrate. And so here she is, pictured at a community dance, doing the do-si-do with one local dignitary. In other words, Eleanor Roosevelt was not the kind of girl to sit in an office somewhere and write letters. She was a very hands-on, active first lady who traveled tens of thousands of miles across the country year to year, visiting with people, talking, informing herself, educating herself, lobbying on behalf of relief efforts for what she and both her husband considered a safety net for the deserving poor in this country. The poor had always suffered a stigma in America, which, after all, was supposed to be the land of opportunity. There was this sort of notion that if you were poor in America, it was due to some moral defect or character flaw. But what the great, and that had always been rubbish, of course, but what the industrial age showed and what the Great Depression in particular showed was that the macroeconomic forces of a global economy were beyond the reach of a single individual, certainly of a single individual worker. And so huge macro trends toward unemployment or depressed wages, for example, had a direct correlation on things like poverty and homelessness that was beyond the reach of an individual worker. Eleanor Roosevelt, looking for concrete achievements, I feel we can really credit to the women the government's attitude of concern for the welfare of human beings. On the whole, more interest is now taken in social questions about the care of citizens who temporarily are unable to take care of themselves, about the care of handicapped children, for example. And so Eleanor Roosevelt was doing more than just breaking the boundaries of what was acceptable for a first lady, that is a presidential wife. She's really helping to redefine the idea of social justice in the 1930s. And one expression of social justice in the Great Depression years, of course, was the Social Security program passed as part of her husband's New Deal initiative. The Social Security was seen in particular as a gendered safety net. It was, on the one hand, a government-sponsored work savings program where employers would be responsible for taking money out of the payroll accounts to save for what would be, on the one hand, a retirement fund for American workers, but just as importantly, as a kind of Social Security fund for American families, particularly families with single-parent households, usually women whose husbands had either divorced or simply left, who were charged with both trying to earn a living wage but also taking care of children. Social Security would now provide dividends for single-parent households to supplement, say, the paycheck of the woman breadwinner so that children might be properly cared for. There had been experiments with this sort of thing during the Progressive era, but really nothing on this scale, nothing as ambitious and as interventionist as the Social Security program of 1935. It was the culmination of progressive legislation, really, that saw the responsibility of the federal government in maintaining that safety net. Now, of course, that proved controversial because conservative critics then, as now, would argue that this was not the proper sphere of government. But nevertheless, we would do well to remember, I think, just how bad things had become in the Great Depression, just how necessary really was some sort of positive action by the government, lest the country simply fall into a pit of despair from which it could not have recovered. That is, there were more than a few warnings in these years that perhaps revolution itself might engulf the nation unless something were done. And that's certainly what we see happen, for example, in Germany in the 1930s, as the Nazi regime uses economic desperation to leverage itself into power. So Roosevelt thought he was taking a fairly conservative course in some ways by heading off that kind of revolution that would undermine American democracy, undermine American capitalism, by priming the pump of economic recovery and public welfare now in the form of New Deal agencies. And again, women often benefited or were a part of these initiatives. White women, as well as women of color. Frances Perkins, here you see at the bottom, was the first woman to have an executive office in a presidential cabinet. She became the new Secretary of Labor. Frances Perkins had been one of those who had lobbied in New York State on behalf of worker safety and particularly fire codes after the Triangle Fire She had been one of those public advocates, you might say, for improving conditions of factory workers and women laborers. Mary McLeod Bethune, here shown above, a woman, an African American woman, formed part of the informal black cabinet of the New Deal. That is, individuals who either were African American themselves or devoted themselves particularly to the issues of racial minorities in the United States. Becomes a woman of significant political influence, but also a kind of role model then for women of color, working on federal emergency relief administration projects, work progress administration projects, even something as simple and local as local sewing projects or school lunch programs. So women at all levels of government, both white women as well as minority women now, in support of Roosevelt's New Deal. So that leads us right up to the point now of World War II, and this is where we're going to divide the lecture, concluding part one. We will come back in part two to look at the experience of American women in wartime.